Okay. Right. Okay, thanks very much, Stern Lady. And I'm really glad to be here. For a moment, I thought I wasn't going to be because we've had a power cut all afternoon and only just came back on in the nick of time to be here. So I'm very glad to see you all, some very familiar faces. I'm going to be talking with Kathryn about Hadrian's Wall in the far west as it travels across the very north of Cumbria, and in particular the stretch from Brough by Sands, which is a village on the Solway Firth about 10 kilometres west of Carlisle, to the end of the wall at Bewness on Solway. And in this area, above ground remains of the stone wall are a rarity. And relatively speaking, little is known about the survival below ground. And the slide on the screen to begin to get you into the mood of this very different landscape is of Port Carlisle, which is a village between Drumbrough and Bewness. And it gives you an idea of the estuary landscape that the wall once cut across. It's gently undulating, but there are sudden and quite pronounced, if low, knolls, and the whole thing is sculpted by water. And another clue to its interesting landscape history is, you can see here, the end of the silted up canal, the remains of a quay, and if you look at this very straight run through the village, the remains of a railway, and we'll come on to that more later. And it's the railway, the development of the canal and the railway, that gave this village its name. It was Fisher's Cross, as the canal, when it hosted the canal, it became Port Carlisle. So this little bit of wall that you can see on the slide now, on the screen now, is actually all that's recorded above ground of the stone curtain wall of Hadrian's Wall in the area. This is about 1 kilometre southeast of Bewness, which is the site of the Fort of Maya. And it's a very short stretch, as you can see, with in situ facing stones. There's not much more than 2 kilometres lying, 2 kilometres, I wish, 2 metres lying each side of this old field gate that you can see. You can see here, these are actually in situ wall facing stones. This has been patched up. These are facing stones that are skewed and slipped out of place. There's some in situ core below this modern mortar that's holding them in, holding them in place. And then on the other side, there are some in situ facing stones right at the base. And you can see some of the core here. And in the grounds, in the gate, you can see these are likely in situ foundation stones, or perhaps the course above foundation. And you can see that there are other stones actually in the gate gap. And here, the course of the wall is actually supporting, you can see the hedge line, supporting the hedge dike. It also has a drain, a field drain, punched right through the centre of it. And you'll see that a bit more clearly later on. Okay. So these beleaguered survivors, they've actually been on the Heritage at Risk Register for many years, and they've actually been repeatedly banged and bashed by ever increasingly larger agricultural machines, and gradually sort of infiltrated and eased apart by the overgrown hedges. And ironically, these 2 particular little bits have probably been preserved because of their usefulness in supporting the gateway. And we'll come back to that issue. So at the end of 2020 and during this year, WallCAP has been carrying out geophysical survey, some targeted excavation, and some consolidation work to investigate these little remains of the wall, to improve their condition and to ensure that they're as protected as possible for the future. Unfortunately, because of the timing, we couldn't involve volunteers because most of the work fell during the peak times of the pandemic. What we're going to do now is discuss that now completed work, because although it was in effect a rescue work, it was also an opportunity to push forward some research. So we're going to be thinking more broadly about why the wall has been so comprehensively levelled in this stretch. We'll be looking at the wall's construction, at this landscape that it's running through, and part of its post-Roman history. And we're hoping to show that the findings from even tiny investigations and excavations can help clarify and illustrate aspects of the fate and the past of the curtain wall. So you're going to hear more about some of these Roman sites later, but just to situate those of you who are not so familiar with the western end of the wall, you can see here's the Solway Firth, and Drumbrough is down here. This is Port Carlisle that you saw in the slide previously, with the remains of the dock's jetty showing quite nicely on this LiDAR. And here is Bewness on Solway. And what this does show rather nicely is the topography, is the lay of the land around here. You can see that it is very flat, but there are, for example, here at Brackenrig and here at Drumbrough, those rather prominent little knolls, and here a rather significant ridge, which we'll come back to. And I don't know if you can see it underneath the green line, but there is a ridge running literally along the line of the wall, because that green is the line of the wall in this part of the world. And we'll be coming back to that. So this is a Google Earth image of zoomed in a little bit from that previous map. And this gives you a better idea of the character of the landscape. There you can see Bewness and Port Carlisle and Bewness Hall, which I will mention again later, which is on one of those knolls. And the line of the wall, it comes up the coast. You can see here the line of the railway, very clearly that straight stretch with the station here. And this crop mark is the line of the wall, and here the wall becomes the hedge boundary. That little stretch of wall I showed you is here. There's the line of the wall again, run as a crop mark through that field, and then it runs all the way along here up to Bewness. But it's just interesting to note how different this landscape is to the better known and more dramatic landscapes that the wall runs through, for example, in the central area. But it's a very captivating landscape with the famous salt marshes, mud flats, mosses and mires, low but shaped by those slight ridges and hummocks, and incised by both natural and channeled and constructed drains and becks. It's an area of outstanding national beauty. There are various SSSIs and national nature reserves and very valuable areas of peat. And there are indeed fords across the shifting landscape of the estuary to Scotland. When you go there today, it might feel rather isolated, but its history has been varied and perhaps sometimes slightly unexpected. It's an area of Scandinavian settlement. The name Solway Firth is Sulvath, or Pillar Ford, and Fjorthur. So it's the inlet of the Pillar Ford. So it's telling you that there have been marked fords across the inlet of the Firth. It was a very disputed border area. And where the wall actually does run close to both the earlier and the present border, unlike further to the east, where I think some people think the border is on the wall, but of course it isn't. And you can see it's primarily pastoral agriculture, diversifying now very much into tourism too. And it's very wet and very subject to flooding. And drainage is a perpetual local preoccupation, quite rightly. And indeed, both the times that we were working, of the 3 or 4 actually, the times we're working there, people have been out there clearing the silt out of drains and channels in the marsh while we were there. That's the line of the wall that I pointed out on the last Google Earth image, and I'll just show you before I move on to the state of the field to the north of the hedge line with the wall in where we were working. this is what it looked like in late autumn. So you can see the problem with drainage. And this field, which is north of the hedge line, is notably lower than the field to the south, which is going to turn out to be quite significant. Now I've got Ian is with us, and he's primed and ready to answer any more complex geological questions that you might have. But the geology is as ever crucial. And the local soft red sandstone is not the best for building, but the red sandstone beach cobbles are entirely suitable for the wall core. And one of the questions, which I think Ian will be able to tell you more about, was some of the harder stone used in the facing stones actually brought across the estuary from further north. You can see here the geology, the yellow here, these are tidal flat deposits, so they're sort of silts and clays, fine soft deposits, and you've got the salt marshes on the edge. But also you've got this blue, which is the glacial till, and that's a mixture that can include some harder boulders and harder bits of stone. And what's significant is that these are the higher areas, and if I fly in a little bit, you can see there's our site, and you can see that the wall is running effectively along the edge of that area of higher glacial till, and that these knolls, there's Bewness Hall, there's Brackenrig, which has got a temporary camp, there's the fort, are on some of these higher areas. Now, I'm going to come back, but I'm going to hand over to Kathryn now to talk a bit more about the Roman sites to set our site that we were working on into a wider context.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, so as the GIS person, sort of the mapping person on the team, I've got a few maps to go through with you to kind of highlight some of the key areas and sites in this west end of the wall. So Jane touched on this a little bit earlier, but we've got the main villages of Bruff by Sands, Drumbruff, Port Carlisle, and Bewness on Solway. Bruff by Sands, Drumbruff, and Port Carlisle were previously linked by the Carlisle to Port Carlisle canal, and that opened in 1823. But that was then later converted into a railway line that opened in 1854, and that connected with the Carlisle to Newcastle line and things like that. So you could kind of get all the way across the country if you wanted to. But you can see the line, it shows it quite clearly on the map, kind of running just south of that green line for the wall. And it runs all the way kind of along that line and out to Port Carlisle. And that construction probably has had some impact on what survives of the wall as well. But if we go to the next slide. So here, if we're looking, we can see a kind of closer look at some of the wall and its features in this stretch. And you can see, looking at kind of color-coded the different sites. So red is assumed and assumed location, and blue is a confirmed site. So we can see that many of the sites, particularly the turrets, are assumed locations, and that this means there's no archaeological evidence for these sites to have been found, and their locations are based purely on sort of the standard way of spacing that we have for measurements from confirmed sites along the wall. And this, you know, is just it's the survive. We don't know, do those sites survive, or if there's just they didn't exist, or we don't know. It's kind of more work needed to be done to kind of check these things. But this is how it would look if everything was spaced out in an ideal sort of circumstance. And I'll point out as well that we've got Brackenrig, and which is to the south of the wall, and then it's Greyhaven or Knockcross to the north, and those are both temporary camps in the area. And so that's interesting just to see, you know, where they were probably sort of settled while they were doing construction out at this end of the wall. And if you go to the next slide. just to talk a little bit more specifically about a couple of the sites. So this is Bruff by Sands, and Bruff by Sands is sitting on the site of Abalava Fort, and so much of the fort has been robbed out, and the fortified border church of St. Michael's is built almost entirely of Roman stone, and is thought to sit on top of the fort's Principia building. So, you know, a central building in the fort has then been converted essentially into the central building of the village. And you can see the photo there. That's all very nice faced red Roman sandstone. And in the 3rd century, the Aurelian Moors, which is a unit from North Africa, was actually stationed at Abalava. And those soldiers then settled in the area, had families, and formed what's been recognized as the first African community in the UK, which is quite interesting. And then if we go to the next slide. And then this is Drumbruff. So this is moving a little bit further west. And Drumbruff sits on the site of Congabata Fort. There's various different sort of spellings and pronunciations of these. So, and you can see here in the LiDAR, you can just make out the edge of the drumlin. So this is at an area of higher ground. So the fort was sited on this bit of high ground, kind of getting it out of the marsh. And this allows for excellent views in all directions. So it's a very good strategic sort of siting of that site. And so there was a large earlier turf fort, and then that was followed by a smaller stone fort, which was occupied until late in the Roman period. And there may also have been the location of a Roman harbor here. This is something that needs sort of more research going into it, because it could be sort of medieval or later kind of activity, but there is thought that there is a Roman Roman harbor at this location. And now within Drumbruff in the village, we've got Drumbruff Castle, and this was originally a Pele Tower that was built in 1307, and it was rebuilt into this sort of castle or fortified tower house in 1518. And this is all built again out of the stone from the fort, and you can see again in that photo, nice Roman stones. And we've also got just out front of that doorway there, there's a nice Roman altar or a bit of carved stone that's sitting there. So it's definitely been, you can see the reuse happening in that structure. And then the next slide. So we kind of zooming back out a little bit, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the wall kind of running through the marsh in this area. And as Jane was saying, it's quite interesting just sort of looking at this and how there is essentially no standing remains for the wall, except for at that spot where we were working. And so the scheduling documentation for this area sort of all states that the wall survives as a buried feature in this area. There is one section between Bruff by Sands and Drumbruff that isn't actually scheduled because there is no survival of the wall itself in that area. And you can see as well that all of the sites, the turrets and the mile castles in that stretch pretty much are assumed locations. And so we have no record of those kind of surviving in the archaeological record. And so the few bits that have been confirmed closer to Bruff by Sands and Drumbruff have been confirmed by little bits of excavation that have happened during building works, or when they've been looking at the fort, or there has been a little bit of geophysical survey that's been done by earlier projects, and they've been able to kind of pick up outlines of the structures or see the line of the wall in that area. So it is a bit puzzling, you know, to wonder why in that sort of really marshy area, why there is no wall. And it has been suggested that there was no curtain wall in this area, but that doesn't seem like a very good defensive kind of strategy if you leave a big hole in your defensive structure. But this area does also fluctuate quite a bit with flooding, and you know, the edge of the firth has moved over the years, and so it could be that you know, it's gone, it's washed away, or something like that. So that is a possibility. And again, you can also see that on the LiDAR, you can pick out the line of the canal and the railway is just south of that bit of the wall. And it's possible that anything that was left got used in that construction. So, and yeah, and Jane mentioned as well that from Port Carlisle to heading further west, that the wall runs on top of a sort of low natural ridge, and that's you know, an old sea bank or one of these kind of glacial areas, glacial till. And we have the only standing remains are the ones at the old field gate. And then if we have that next little bit with the
Yep.
Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, so you can see there in purple our little excavation area, kind of just sitting nicely between, not too far from the confirmed mile castle, but we haven't confirmed the next turret in that area. And we've got a photo of that, kind of a closer photo at the bit of surviving wall. So this is again a little bit more on the other side of the gate as well, but this is pretty much the only bit of standing wall in that entire section. Or it is, sorry, the only bit of standing wall in that section. So yeah, and yeah, very likely only survived because of that gate. So as many problems as it's caused, it's also been quite helpful in keeping that little bit of wall nice and safe. So I'll pass it back to you, Jane.
Thanks, Kathryn. Okay, so I'm going to move back into more recent history. And of course, this was, as I mentioned, a border region, of course, troubled by a lot of cross-border conflict in the medieval period. And King Edward, the Hammer of the Scots, died in the area in 1307. And it was also drawn into that vigorous and violent currents of a border reiver life. And it's these sorts of periods that give us the context for some of the more sort of the organised robbing of the wall. Kathryn showed you the fortified church tower of the 12th century St Michael's at Brough by Sands, and she showed you Drumborough Castle. But what's harder to immediately detect is the impact on the landscape and on the wall that was exerted from, well, I suppose, especially the 18th century on, of mining and the transport of mined iron and coal, and indeed of people. Think back to the remains of those the port docks and the jetty on that first slide. And as Kathryn mentioned, in 1823, a canal was dug from Carlisle to the newly renamed Port Carlisle. And that was dug initially it was intended to be a major artery of coal transportation, 11.5 miles long, and included dressed sandstone walls and stone docks. And unfortunately, its need declined fairly rapidly, and they tried to revive its fortunes by also turning it into a way of taking people from Carlisle along the canal and straight on to Liverpool to go off to America or wherever. And when the canal was dug, the foundations of the wall where the canal crossed it, and 2 or 3 of those places are in the vicinity of Port Carlisle, it was found to sit on piling, and some of that was reused, we know, for the jetty at Port Carlisle, and we suspect, of course, very much more of the stone was used in those works. But then, of course, it was the railways that did for the canals. And in 1845, the Carlisle to Maryport Railway opened to the south of the area that we're focusing on. And then there's this sort of crucial decade for the wall and its robbing of between 1850 and 1860. In the 1850s, the canal was pretty much redundant, and it was drained and converted and made into the bed for the Port Carlisle Railway, which was constructed in 1856 to 1857, and included the construction of new docks and jetty. And then also in 1856, the Drumbrough to Silloth line with a junction just southeast of Drumbrough was constructed. And you can see all those on the map on the slide. And then from 1869 until 1921, the whole estuary was crossed by the Solway Junction Railway, this one taking iron to works in Lanarkshire. So just stop and think for one moment what all that demand for all sorts of stone for stations, walls, bridges, and the likely impact that would have had on any upstanding bits of the wall. And you can see on this 1900s map, there's our little site here. And you can, that's the line of the wall, if you remember. Here's one railway, there's the junction running off this way, and here's the railway crossing the mosses and across the estuary off to Scotland. And in this context, the stretches of the curtain wall that were most likely to survive were those that were actually useful in effect as walls that were embedded in still used current active field boundaries. And I think that's true of the stretches either side of the site we were working at, where those field boundaries can be traced from historic mapping, including this 1900s and from much earlier, right up to the modern day. So if I zoom in a bit now and look at the immediate landscape of the site, so I've said that something of the wall is definitely surviving in these hedges, and you can see it's saying Roman wall at site of here. And this stretch here, this that runs up northwest towards Bewness and the Fort of Mire, on earlier maps, it's marked as the old mill race. You can see it runs absolutely along the course of the wall all the way for that stretch. And the significance of the watercourses is also shown clearly in this wonderful illustration by James Irving Coates. Now, he's a really interesting man, born in Darlington in 1848. He was a teacher and then a headmaster in Leeds, and finally he was ordained, and he was an incredibly keen amateur archaeologist. And in 1999, Ackworth, which was his old school, discovered a stack of drawings and watercolours that he'd made of sites along Hadrian's Wall as he surveyed them between 1877 to 1896. And of course, that included details of things that have since been lost because of deterioration or development or whatever. And if you look at this illustration of his here, made in 1879, so a little bit before the 1900s map, but not much more, you can see that there's a windmill up on the horizon, and that's the one that is in the northwest corner of the fort in Bewness, and it gives us the direction that this painting is facing. And the windmill is actually shown on another of Coates' paintings, looking up at Bewness from the coast. And the windmill was actually demolished between 1880 and 1885. But as I said, it lets us decide what direction of his paintings. He doesn't actually give detailed directions as to where these places are. And you can see that there are these wedge-shaped stones, and they've been discussed as bridge foundations, but they're perhaps more likely to be something like maybe a tiny little bridge, or more likely a culvert. And when we look at the old map, we can see two possible locations where that painting might have been made. One, this is a watercourse, and you can see it turns a corner here and is crossed by the wall there. And then there's another one up here where there's a watercourse that crosses the line of the wall. But I suspect it's probably this one, because if you look on the drawing, you can see the line, a hedge line running up off to the right, which I suspect is probably this one. So we've got a painting in the very near vicinity of our site, which shows not much of the wall, and an indication of the ways in which these watercourses are cutting through and bisecting the landscape. If we look in that circle that's marked on the slide in the top corner, if we zoom in on that area, you can just see on this 1970s map all the ponds and drains. This is that drain that runs along the course of the wall, in just that little area. You saw how wet the field to the north of our site became. So water and its management and containment is a constant thread through the use of this landscape. So I'm looking now at another of Coates's paintings, which he says was near Bewness. Again, he's not giving us exact locations. But if you look at, excuse me, what other antiquarians have said about this part of the wall, Horsley in 1732, excuse me a moment, said that the wall stood at that time in 1732 at half a mile east of Bewness. It stood about 3 meters or 10 foot high. And that if you go half a mile east of Bewness, that brings us into the area that I've ringed on the map here. In 1801, Hutton described this general area as having a length of wall about half a kilometre or 500 to 600 yards long, which was often 3 foot high and in 2 places up to 6 foot high and up to 8 foot wide and 3 foot thick, but without any stone facing. So when Hutton was describing the area in 1801, he describes the vast majority of it as having no stone facing. Hutton also met a farmer when he was wandering around who bragged he'd already destroyed large parts of the wall. And when Collingwood Bruce first saw it in the 1850s, he remarked that it was several feet high and that between Port Carlisle and Bewness, it was customary to remove it in the 19th century by blasting. So quick and nasty. And if you think about the period we're talking about, and if you think back to the amount of building, railways and canals that was going on, it puts that remark in context. And then if you look at Irving Coates's painting from 1877, so we're looking at the period after all that railway construction, he notes that the mound of wall core is about 4 foot high, and you can see it surviving in a hedge bank with absolutely no evidence for facing stones. And I can't actually see either in that painting, the way he's depicted it, any evidence for the drain that we know ran along the whole of this length of the wall. So if this is a stretch of wall in a hedge bank near Bewness, it's probably going to be, again, somewhere very close to our site, if not in stretch immediately next to it. So if you look at this again, I just remind you about the line of the wall and of that role in the LiDAR of the likely estuary bank, and that's the location of Milecastle 79. Okay, so final little painting by Coates, which he talks about as being a 1/4 mile west of Port Carlisle. Now, if you go a 1/4 mile west from Port Carlisle, you end up exactly where we were working. And you look at that painting and you can see the view that we were looking at out across the estuary and into the hills north of it. And you can see that when you look across here, you can see that there's hedge lines here and here, and you can see a hedge line running across like that. So again, we've got a bit of evidence of very close, if not actually our site, showing a hedge line probably composed mostly of wall core with a little bit of surviving wall facing there. Now, the only substantial excavations that have been in the vicinity, direct vicinity, are at Milecastle 79, which is about just over 200 meters east of that little survivor. And there was a little excavation in the 1930s, which wasn't at the Milecastle, but was in very close to it, which looked at the wall and talked about the wall being on a sea bank. and being 2.82 meters wide, with no ditch to the north. Is that the wall, as you know, had its own ditch to the north of it. And the presence or absence of that ditch is one of the questions that is raised about this length of Hadrian's Wall. Was there a ditch to the north, or did its close proximity to the estuary mean that that part of the normal wall complex wasn't actually included? But then the first actually significant major excavation of the Mile Castle itself was in 1949. A lot of the workers were Ukrainian POWs. And the excavators, Richmond and Gillam, reported that although the turf Mile Castle layers that survived underneath the stone castle were well preserved, the stone wall ones were not. But they did record a section through what survived of the south face of the curtain wall, and they recorded that it was only one course high, and that single course was sitting on founding flags, and the wall was at that point 2.7 meters wide. So here you can see their drawing of, here's the Mile Castle, and these are the stretches of wall running there. And at the time of this excavation, they make an interesting remark, which is that the section of standing wall 245 yards to the west of the Mile Castle, and that brings us bang to that funny little survivor, was described as massive. Now, it can't have been. We've got so much evidence that what there cannot have been is a massive bit of wall surviving there. But perhaps what they were referring to was not the size so much as the quality of the surviving construction, the sort of quality of the surviving construction work. But another question they raised, aside from the question of the North Ditch in their excavations, was related to a building platform. And they reported that both the turf and the stone Mile Castles and the wall were built on an artificial platform that the builders had made of alternate layers of gravel and turf, forming the surface upon which the wall castle and the turf wall itself had been erected. Their suggestion was that this had been done to raise both structures above the high spring and neap tides of the estuary. And this platform wasn't small, it was up to 1.4 meters high above the glacial till, and it's what's described as the sea bank on this drawing. And they interpreted as running under the wall in both directions, but quite why they were so confident that the platform ran under the wall itself, as well as the Mile Castle, is unclear, because they did say that they noted that the exact limits of the platform couldn't be traced, and there are absolutely no helpful drawings or photographs in their report to allow you to be confident about their belief that they had actually built a 1.4 meter high platform under the wall, and that's what's created that role in the landscape. I wonder perhaps whether the forts were built on some kind of platform, but that the line of the wall was actually simply following that firm relict estuary bank itself. And they noted here that they believed the ditch was absent. Now, Tony Wilmot did excavate Mile Castle 79 again as part of the Hadrian's Wall Mile Castles project. But these were very small scale and targeted excavations within the Mile Castle, which did reveal some evidence for both the turf and the stone Mile Castle, and for the platform within the Mile Castle, but not couldn't actually provide any further evidence because of its character for towards helping out answering the question about whether there was a platform under the wall. So we can now move actually on to the work that we did. And you can see here at the top of the slide on a 1970s map, this is a depiction of our little bit of wall. And this is our trench 2. And this is our trench 1, which was sort of in two halves across the hedge bank. This is the line of that mounded hedge bank in the field. Now, what we were trying to do was not only we wanted to do some geological survey north and south of this stretch of the wall. We wanted to use the opportunity of doing some work to help consolidate and protect the wall, to investigate its survival. And the idea was that we were going to excavate in this area, because you can see here in the 1970s, an agricultural building is marked as having been built bang smack across the line of the wall. And so the idea was that that might have been, it might have actually removed all traces of the wall in that area, and that we could then go back here, move that gate and put a bigger and better gate in here for the farmer, and then do the consolidation work on this little bit of wall and fence it off and protect it so that it wasn't going to be bashed and banged anymore. And during that time, we were hoping that, as well as recording and consolidating and doing that little bit of excavation, we might ask some questions about whether there was any turf wall survival, was there a north ditch or not, and was the wall built on a platform or on a sea bank. And I'm now going to hand over to Kathryn to talk about the geophysics and a bit of the excavation before I take over, just to wrap up the results at the end. Kathryn.
Thanks, Jane. So we initially tried to do some geophysical survey in the beginning of November 2020. And as we saw earlier, the field was more of a swamp than anything else. So we quickly abandoned that and came back in April of this year to do that survey. So we did gradiometry and resistivity. So gradiometry survey measures the magnetic anomalies in the soil, and resistivity measures changes in the electrical resistance as it runs through the ground. So this is the gradiometry survey. So this was done in a 30-meter grid. And what we found with this is that it hasn't necessarily highlighted any features, but it has shown us quite clearly or a little bit more clearly, the geology in this area. And so, because you can see because this was done on the same day, you can see that there is a difference between north and south, with the line of the wall running in the middle. And as we mentioned before as well, there is a height difference between the two fields too, so that's going to have some impact. And so the geology of the southern field is much clearer in the gradiometry survey. And we can see that it's more geological, and a lot more glacial till is happening in this area. While the north field is more sort of fluvial, sort of flood deposit soil. And this is much clearer in the resistivity. Sorry, can you go to the next one? Yeah, and then the resistivity was done in 20-meter grid. So you can see again that there's a little bit more that's visible in the north field here. Possibly you might have a bit of a ditch going across that, but it's difficult to tell whether that's Roman or just other sort of drainage activity that's going on in this area. And there is sort of something possibly running sort of from the southwest to the northeast of that first grid, but that could also have something to do with where they were driving coming out of the gate, because there was quite a bit of sort of churned up soil and stuff in that area, so that could have some impact on what we were seeing there. And if we go to the next bit. So I'm going to start with our trench 2, and this was a bit of a sort of, we were there and we had the opportunity to do a little bit more digging while we were out in the field, and we thought we'd put in a trench that was placed where we had this, there was a bit of a gap in the hedgerow. It's sort of thinned out, particularly on the south side of that hedgerow. And there was possible in situ facing stones sort of peeking through this bank of the field boundary. And we were like, we thought, well, we should definitely just have a look and see what's going on with that. And we'll have a look. But what we found is there'd actually been what appears to be an earlier mid-Victorian building that had been placed there at this location. And so they appear to have built a small structure, so, like just where they needed them. So similar to what we saw with the 1970s structure, they sort of, needed some shelter for their cattle or their sheep, or just something to store other bits for the farm. And so they've thrown up this little building that's taken advantage of using the line of the wall and this bank as one wall of that structure. So the upper fill of the trench contained sort of demolition debris from this building, with 19th century ceramics, glass, and a bone knife handle, as well as handmade bricks that continued actually under the line of what is the wall, and under these sort of facing stones that were there and into the field boundary and the hedgerow. And so it looks like the building was demolished and the rubble was then used to recreate this bank, including then placing some of the little bits of remaining sort of facing stones or work stones back into the bank to recreate this sort of idea of the wall being there. And you can see in that top corner some of the bits that we've pulled out of the trench, and sort of in the bottom photo, you can see a few bits. There's some orange bits kind of peeking out at near the bottom of that trench, and those are the bricks that are still in section, running back through. And the facing stones that we thought were in situ also appear to have toppled, so they're not actually sitting nicely as they would have been if it was the face of Hadrian's Wall. And if we go to the next slide, and I'll quickly just speak about Trench 1 on the north. So it became a theme that when Jane and I went out digging, that I dug on the north side of the wall and Jane dug on the south side of the wall. So this happened at a few of our sites. So again, the north side of the wall was lower than the south side, so the field's a bit lower. And the impact of flooding in this field and in this trench was much more evident. So there is much fewer stone in this. It's very stony, but overall, we'll see in a moment, there's much fewer stone in this trench, and the bank appeared to be made of redeposited fluvial deposits and then glacial till rather than anything sort of really structured. And so this has kind of been pushed up to create that bank, and this was done after the building was demolished in the 1970s. And some of this could be redeposited wall core, and we have comparing it to other bits of in situ wall core that we've seen in other sites. It did look very similar, but without, we can't necessarily say for certain, but it's definitely looking like stuff that's come out of the wall. And so it's but again, just much more sort of, we see a lot more of that flooding impact here. A lot more water had run through this side of the bank as well, and really blurring sort of the lines between different deposits as well. So it kind of becomes sort of one homogeneous sort of fill in some ways. And then I'll pass it back to Jane. She'll tell you about the south side. Okay,
so there am I on the south side, with the view out across the estuary in this case, and there were significant differences between the north and the south, and there was even more disturbance in the layers that formed the south bank slope, and that's shown on this side of the slide. And that's the result of the building and the destruction of the 1970s structure that you saw on the map. All facing stones had gone, and the wall core material had been repurposed, initially as the revetment for the hedge bank before the building, then in the building construction, and finally it was all piled back up to recreate the hedge. It had also been disturbed by the digging of a rubble French drain parallel to the line of the wall. Time and again, we were met by the impact of water and drainage on the wall in this stretch. Now, remember that Kathryn's side, the north, was lower than the southern side, and at a very high level, it's quite hard to see in the photographs, but a very high level, relatively speaking, to the south, we came across solid sandstone geology, which is likely to have been part of a relic natural riverine or estuarine bank. And this and the glacial till layers, which were very clear on this side, support the hypothesis that the raised role in the landscape and in the LiDAR is at least in part a natural geological feature, and that we're not looking at any kind of platform. And we certainly didn't come across any remains of the turf wall. And the upper part of the hedge bank on this side was 80% at least of subangular yellow sandstone rubble, which is likely to have been the substance of the curtain core material, along with the occasional large rounded beach cobble of red sandstone, which would have been readily available on the shore at the Solway Firth, just to the north. And so you can see this very much like the hedge bank in Coates's images, and that material being used to create the bank, reused in the building, piled back up again to reform the bank. And the farmer who now looks after these fields remembers rebuilding that bank with the material that was available after the outbuilding blew down in the 1970s. Now, once we'd investigated this area and found that there wasn't any undisturbed wall remains there, we could go ahead with the next part of our work, which was the consolidation. And Heritage Consolidation, the wonderful firm that we've been working with on a lot of the sort of repair and work on the wall, came along and they cut back vegetation and bushes. They tail bedded with mortar, these loose stones with suitable mortar as necessary to hold it together, and topped it with these plugs of turf that grow in and help knit the stones together. But the preparation work for that reconsolidation fully revealed the state that this stretch of the wall was in, especially to the east of the gate, and that's in this stretch here. To the west, you've got up to 3 courses surviving in situ, but the north side here, the other side of this, had completely collapsed. No sign of any facing stones and very little of the core surviving in situ. And to the east, so in this area here, the north side had completely gone, and it really was just a loose pile of core stone rubble. And this discrepancy in survival of the south faces and the north faces is likely caused by what Kathryn referred to, which is the repeated flooding of the lower north field, and then the shifting of these light soils during sort of repeated inundations, which would constantly undermine the curtain wall remains. And without the facing stones, that core was destabilized and collapsed towards the north. And then continuing attempts to improve the drainage by running drains along beside the wall and here punch straight through the gap also disturbed the archaeology. And we found that looking at this gap in the gate, that what we thought might have been some more in situ stones were in fact twisted and displaced, like those ones we saw in Trench 2. So you can see here that the consolidation work done, it's as good as it can be, and the gate is wired shut and the whole thing is fenced off, and it's going to be much safer now. And then there was the new gate, which all went fine. You can see here's that bit of hedge bank that we looked at, gone, bulldozered away, and the new gate in place. And we watched very carefully as all this was done, of course, and it all went smoothly, but for one small exception, which is in the far west of the opening for the wider gate, at field ground level and in the centre of the line of the wall, we came across a layer of modern looking mortar ceiling and an even layer of what looked like core stones below. And the heritage consolidation team compared the mortar used there to that which had probably been used in the 1970s to roughly repair that stub of wall to the west of the old gate. And they seemed to be a really good match. So what we did was heritage consolidation put an extra ceiling skim of lime mortar over that area, and then the contractors built up a lovely sort of dry stone protecting bit over it, and we left it all in situ. It could be that that mortaring had been done at the time of the building construction in this area just to level things off, or perhaps to support a wall that ran up to the building. And there you, oops, sorry, wrong way. And there you can see that area carefully protected and not going anywhere in the new arrangement. And the interesting thing was that as the post holes for the new gate posts were dug, we encountered the deglacial tills, and then at the same depth as we did in the excavation, mineral stained solid sandstone, this again picks up the estuary bank along that north edge of which the curtain wall was built, which also helps to explain the course, the sort of relatively sinuous course of the curtain wall in this stretch where it tracks the edge of that bank. And as we hammered in each of the new wooden fence posts south of the hedge bank, at the same level we encountered that solid sandstone. You could hear from the change in vibration and see from the extra effort needed by the fencing machine that we'd got to that point, whereas the new fence posts north of the dike went in very easily as they were just going through the silty deposits to the north, as Kathryn was describing. And all these posts, of course, are well clear of any width of the wall. And once they were all in, the rest of the fencing went up, and we'd finished. But that final phase had only emphasised the sort of extent of the collapse of the wall around the gate, the impact of flooding and poor drainage, and attempts to tackle the problem that what they've had on the wall's survival. So why did so little of the wall remain? You'll have picked it all up as we went along, and that the surviving sections are likely to have been, in our stretch, likely to have been described by a number of people in those reports from the 18th and 19th century. It's a lucky survival because it held up the gate, and the other elements that survive without facing stone are there because they're in the hedge bank. But obviously it's been so comprehensively stripped because it runs straight through fields and farming land, and its survival depends on whether it's handy in defining continuing boundaries. And it's also because of its location on that estuary, undermined by flooding and the impact of repeated drainage works. And also with the lack of good building stone in the area, or at least readily accessible, and being itself, the walls, so accessible for ransacking, you can see early fortified buildings, canals, docks, jetties, railway structures, later buildings like Bewness Hall. This is the big farm on one of those knolls, and Kathryn and I went for a little walk, and look what we saw, just piled up alongside the fencing there. So that's all sort of more concerted and organised robbing, but it's an active working landscape. Inevitably, there's ongoing attrition caused by foraging over the centuries for farm buildings, the effects of stock and machinery damaging, and the consequent machinery damage and the consequences of hedge removal and ploughing. But it's also, you can see how the walls played a very active role, and its fate is sort of reflecting in this engaging landscape's changing character and fortunes. Thank you.